Welcome to Tech on Earth, a podcast aimed at bringing a practical lens to tech ethics around the world. I'm Elizabeth Ranieris, founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab at the University of Notre Dame. Today, I am joined by Dr. Amana Raquib, a professor at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, Pakistan, an expert on the Islamic Ethics of Technology. Dr. Raquib, thank you so much for being with us today and for joining me so early in the morning from Karachi. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor.
Great. So I'd like to begin where we typically do on this podcast, which is with your personal journey. Tell us, how did you come to study and publish on Islamic perspectives on technology ethics?
All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'll begin with the name of God, who is the most beneficent, the most merciful. I actually started off my career doing an undergrad in philosophy. I graduated back in 2004. And while I was studying for my philosophy degree, simultaneously I was enrolled in a program that looked closely at the Islamic scripture, the text. So I was doing the two programs simultaneously, and then I used to come across questions and ideas which I would then try to sort of situate within the Islamic theology and try to figure out some of the answers. And then also at the same time, I found out that there are some very pressing contemporary questions or other dilemmas that the Muslims need to deliberate upon. And while, for instance, I was studying philosophy of science and critical theory, I was surprised by the fact that many of the Muslim intellectuals, intelligentsia, scholars, they weren't as aware of that. So because of the colonial heritage, the Muslim populace, the more educated people were too awed with science and technology and were not very cognizant of those deeper questions of an ethical nature. So that's when sort of I might say vaguely that's when sort of I thought that there was a need to work on that. And again, not just something that requires a deconstruction, because there is a lot of critique already that was being produced within the Western, academic literature in the past few decades. So I thought that there needs to be some constructive work that needs to be done through an Islamic, metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical perspective. So when I started off my doctoral program, I was more bent upon working on science, but somehow it eventually, turned out to be technology.
Got it. That's really fascinating. I mean, you bring together so many disciplines in your own background. And I think those of us working in this field are recognizing more and more the importance of true interdisciplinarity. Let's dive right into the Islamic perspective. And we can start perhaps from the critical lens and then turn to the more constructive perspective as you frame it. So from a critical or more negative frame, I think you've said or you've written that there's a crisis of morality as a result of what you term postmodern technologies. I was hoping you could help us understand what you mean by this and unpack a bit of what postmodern technologies are and how you view them through an Islamic perspective.
What we call modern technology had this built-in optimism where, there were those higher ideals of, let's say, human progress. There was, meliorism, things that we find in people like Dewey and others. So there is like a hope and optimism, right, in terms of perhaps some sort of a general human betterment, kind of a utopia. But that's like now seriously questioned both on the theoretical and practical grounds, right? So practically, we have seen, some immense destruction in the past century as a result of the technological advancement. But even on a more theoretical level, we are encountering those deeper questions of morality, right? And or what should be the goal, the ideal, what sort of a human society do we want to create, what sort of individuals do we want to have who inhabit those societies. And those questions are difficult to answer because of the perspectives that lack a deeper metaphysical basis, right? So in such a situation, we are sort of in a deadlock position, right? Where we don't have a strong foundation to provide us with a stable morality to guide our goals and aims towards which we should be designing our technology. And in that sort of a moral vacuum, what happens is that technology assumes the higher end, becomes an end in itself. And this is what I call postmodern, the extreme manifestation of that postmodern condition, right? Where means become ends, right? So you become, I can illustrate that, for instance, like I'm talking to you via this technological medium, right? So what is the intrinsic end here in our conversation is having a meaningful intellectual, conversation about some pressing ethical problems that humanity is facing, right? And it could have been through a number of means, right? We could have been talking over phone, we could have met in person, right? It doesn't matter, right? What means we use, but in a way, if means take over, right, it becomes more important, the kind of sophisticated means that we are using that can keep us in touch, 24/7, that becomes more important.
Yeah, let's zoom in on those means versus ends, because I know your book is focused on, I believe what you term an objectives approach, right? Or I don't want to mispronounce this, Maqāṣid. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
And so is this what your book is getting at in terms of an objectives approach? Could you elaborate on your view there?
Oh, sure. So basically, in trying to address that sort of gap or vacuum that I just mentioned, I have tried to sort of use a traditional, Islamic ethical resource, right? And that is the Maqāṣid, right? And the Maqāṣid al-Sharia is primarily, it's a paradigm where the early Muslim theologians, they tried to sort of excavate, or they sort of derived some basic ethical principles or objectives from the scriptures, that is from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So there are like lots of particulars that are mentioned in the scriptures, but they wanted to derive those, general principles that are actually meant to be preserved and protected. And they called it the Maqāṣid, or the objective, that the whole religion of Islam, or the Islamic ethics, is meant to safeguard these certain basic fundamentals, right? And there's some disagreement over that, but so generally speaking, they talk of those 5 universals, and that's all, for all humanity. That's not just for Muslims, and that's like religion, life, intellect, wealth, and honor, right? Or your lineage. And they say that no matter what we are asked to do, or what we are prevented from doing, both the do's and the don'ts, that's part of the Islamic ethics, is meant to protect these fundamental universals. And that's actually meant to ensure, another term that I have used, that my work is based upon, is the maslaha, or the well-being, which means that these objectives are meant to secure the collective well-being of humankind. And that's why it's very important to safeguard those.
Yeah, so this well-being concept is really interesting as well. So one of the things that our lab is focused on are values underlying technologies and approaches to technology. And I know you've also talked a lot about values. I want to look at what some of the predominant values are today in the technology conversation and how they compare to core Islamic values. So I was asking about this example of efficiency, right, which is very predominant in the conversation, versus a value like compassion and how you think about the interplay there.
So efficiency is actually the most important value when it comes to technology today, right? Efficiency, and I would also add convenience, for instance, and that goes very well with the instrumental logic that informs the technological paradigm today, right? And also because when we don't have any foundation to give us any sort of final values to aim towards, what happens is that efficiency becomes the highest value, or rather the norm, right? And it becomes enough to just say, as a justification or as a rationale behind anything or any technology or technological application, that it saves up on time, it's more efficient, it saves up on labor, so on and so forth.
I just want to zoom in a bit. So I want to make this more concrete for listeners who maybe are not, so deep in this conversation, but let's look at a specific industry or, technology, or maybe something like healthcare. How would these values perhaps play out in a specific context or industry like that? Could you give us some examples perhaps?
Yes, because right now, when we were working on artificial ethics, right, and we were looking at, caring bots, for instance, right, in terms of, who are more efficient, who are supposed to be more efficient than, let's say, human carers. But then there's this element of compassion that's like, and human conscious compassion that would be lacking in that. And the other thing, looking from the Islamic, and I think we actually share this with other religious traditions like Christianity, and I think almost all other religious traditions, where when we are caring for other people, let's say sick people or patients, it's not just meant for their physical recovery or physical revival. There are lots of other dimensions when we are caring for the patient. It's one, because when we are sort of in such a close proximity with a sick person, we really understand deep enough the frailty of human life in and of itself. And then from an ethical perspective, we have this opportunity, this chance of doing good for someone. And then at the same time, when we do good to other people, in terms of taking care of them, we have a chance of raising in our own spiritual heights, right? And being able to become closer and closer to the ideal of moral excellence, right? So, for instance, in Islam, it's a very highly rewarding thing to go and visit the sick people, right? And it's not just enough to have, a Zoom chat with them, right? It's actually to go there, to be with them. And in this time of the alienation and loneliness that we are suffering, where this, loneliness has become one of the syndromes of our postmodern age, right? People are just, they don't have anyone, and they are always looking forward to having real human company. Right?
Yeah, and we saw this play out very much in the pandemic, right? Where we had, we were keeping people connected, whether in nursing homes or hospitals with devices, but perhaps lacking the human connection, the physical touch, other elements, that go beyond what can be facilitated by modern or postmodern technology. So I think that's a really vivid example.
All right. Can I add one more thing?
Please.
So if I'm talking about the Islamic perspective, then there's this concept of human nature, which is called Fitra, right? And this we have this belief that this Fitra is part of our humanness, right? It's part of our metaphysical being, and that Fitra sort of defines who we are, and it's part of human Fitra to be a sociable being. You want other human, and that's how we are designed by God, and that's why God always places us in family. So He has structured the world accordingly, right? So we are never born in a way that we don't have those human social connections, right? And that's why it's appropriate, when defining wellness or well-being or human well-being, this concept of fitra is very important, right? Because otherwise it's like very difficult to define what's wellness, right?
Yeah.
So that's the standard, the gold standard, right?
Yeah.
And it plays out, especially when we are talking about things like compassion, the human element, and so on and so forth.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because I think one of the things that comes up for me a lot in the technology ethics conversation is just how individualistic it can be, right? And so we talk about individual well-being and values, but not so much the collective or the social or the interpersonal. And I think what you're describing sounds like both dimensions, that you kind of need the individual and the collective to have a complete view of this. Is that an accurate representation?
Yes. And that's the beauty of the Islamic ethical system, actually, because you are at the same time, you're working on your own personal ethics, morality, spirituality, enhancing your intellectual abilities, but that's tied to the good of the community, the society, the humankind as a whole. And also in my book, I've talked about it. So also the paradigm that I've used there, the objectives paradigm, it talks about, it's very clear in that when, if an individual good is harming a collective good, it's a principle, also a legal maxim in Islam. And again, when I say legal maxim, it's not just law, it's actually ethical/legal maxim, that if the individual good is conflicting with the collective good, then the collective good is to be prioritized, right? And there's a consensus over that. And also, for instance, when I mentioned those 5 objectives, and it's pertinent to what you asked earlier regarding efficiency and compassion and those sorts of, which value we should prioritize and what should be the formula to decide that, right? So we have also this classification of necessities, needs, and enhancements, right? Again, we have Arabic terms for that, but I won't use that. And that's like, so sometimes, for instance, if there's we are talking about human life, the objective of human life, and we are talking about wealth, for instance, right? Now, there's a value in protecting wealth, and you could have more efficient means that could perhaps be more economically efficient, right? But is that a necessity or a need or an enhancement, right? With respect to the preservation of wealth and whatever resources, versus there's something that's at the level of necessity in terms of human life, right? So if we are talking about compassion, and that's a fundamental human value, right? Because if we lose that, we sort of lose something fundamental about being humans, right? So then we have to see, right? So we can give up efficiency because it would perhaps come under enhancements versus something that would come under necessity, right? So that's always sort of an ongoing debate, right? We have the framework, and then when we talk about these emerging issues or cases or whatever, we sort of apply that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So based on what we've talked about, what I'm hearing is that you're saying, technology has sort of become the means and the ends. It's an end in itself, but it doesn't have these values embedded in it, and this value of efficiency or convenience, these values are overtaking more important, perhaps more human values that are coming from religion, culture, other traditions. So I'm curious, from your perspective, given that you are focused on a constructive approach to technology ethics, what, if anything, can be done about this, given how concerning this phenomenon is?
Yes. So I would say that there's a lot that can be done potentially, but only if there are well-intending, well-meaning people. So it's not something that's really out of hand. I argued this in my book as well. That strong thesis of technological determinism. I don't agree with that. I think there's like a two-way traffic where there's like a technology shaping human beings, but human beings, society shaping technology. right? So it's going hand in hand. Technology, it does shape us in many irreversible ways, but only because we allow it to, either deliberately. So it's primarily when we design technology. Prior to my work, and thankfully now I see a lot of literature coming up, that's focusing on design. Because when I was back in 2010, 11, when I started off with my work, there was a lot of emphasis on the responsibility on people who consume technology. They should be responsible use and so on, but not much on the designer's end, right? So again, it has to start there. Even that, I would say that's not enough, because again, if we look at holistically, right, technology is part of our societal social dynamics, right? Even saying that we can somehow fix this problem with technology in isolation, I don't think this would work. And this has been working precisely because where does technology come from, right? There are human beings who are designing it. And those human beings, whether they are very aware, cognizant or not, they have some value framework that is informing their decisions. So I'd give you an example, right? So for instance, when let's say Steve Jobs, right? He had a vision, right? So the vision is either a personal vision, or this vision is informed by some sort of a meta narrative about what humans should be doing, right? So in that sense, he envisioned everybody having a smartphone, right? And he translated his vision into reality. Now this is what is happening all around us, right? So but the question is, that vision steers technology, but the vision itself is not technological, right? There's some informing higher paradigm, right? It's culturally informed, and that's where I believe this postmodern idea comes in, right? Because having lost faith, right, in anything that's like really meaningful, ethically driven, it becomes more of sort of innovation for the sake of innovation, right? You just try and you just sort of put things up there and see how they proceed. That's sort of a logic behind this constant, incessant inventions. So I would say, I'm sorry, I lost track. So what was your original question?
I think you've answered it, which is what can be done. And it sounds like I've heard a number of answers from you. One is obviously to zoom out, to look beyond the technology, right? To contextualize this more and to look at the human values embedded. You've talked about design. I mean, I would like to give you the opportunity. Our lab is very focused on applied technology ethics. So do you have maybe one or two very practical, tangible takeaways for, let's say, global companies who really are concerned about this? And do you want to think about translating some of your work into practice?
Sure, I would be happy to do that. But again, I wouldn't say that, if somebody asked me that, we are designing this, this one technology, can you come and help us with that one technology? I don't think this works. It would work this way, right? Because one technology, again, is part of a greater nexus, a web of technologies. And Hans Jonas actually gives a very, pertinent example of, let's say, steam engines, when they started off back in the 19th century. So it's basically, it's a whole gamut, right? And then, you started digging out coal, right? And you designed a steam engine so that you could, dig it out of the mines and take it out. But then the steam engine themselves needed more coal. So you had to dig up more, So you see this sort of a imperative that starts happening.
Absolutely.
So it's not just one technology. And that's what my work is meant to emphasize, that it's a collectivity of those technologies. And also behind the technology. So if we are designing, again, the same question, what sort of human individuals we want to design, what sort of families we want to design, what sort of communities and societies we are looking forward to, right? So those are some fundamental questions. And actually, this has come up in our own research of thinking of the whole educational paradigm. So we started off with this idea that the engineers, the design engineers, they are not equipped to actually tackle such questions, right? So when they design, they are more focused on, the productivity, the efficiency side, and they think themselves to be just problem solvers. They give solutions for those technical problems, right? Of how to make something more efficient, remove the errors and so on, right? And also the question of, not just the question of how we should design it in the best possible way, for instance, to sort of align with the ethical values, but some very basic key questions of whether there is a need to design it in the first place, right? Those critical questions that need to be asked, and which I think are not being asked presently. And then, of course, also the consequences that can be enumerated, because I've emphasized this point in my book as well, that Islamic ethics is not purely consequentialist, but of course, it does take into consideration consequences. And we know that, what the past few decades have shown us are some very grave consequences, right? So again, there has to be the right intention, there has to be the right goal or objective, then the right sort of design or methodology, and then the right consequences.
And it sounds like the lack of intention is an intention in some instances, right?
Postmodern nihilism
right.
is out, right? That
right.
You don't have intention of doing anything, and then anything can happen.
Yeah, exactly. So just to wrap up here, I guess one final question to take us out on an optimistic note is, what makes you hopeful about the future of technology ethics?
The disaster that we are experiencing right now. I feel that unless there's something really serious to make more and more people question it and not have this very naive optimism regarding, technological progress or technology for the sake of technology, right? So when people see those brutal, killings, the loss of human compassion, the question of, how we can differentiate, reality from VR and those sorts of things, right? Then I think we will gather the momentum where these things, people would become serious about these things. And the worse it gets, I think the hope for better.
I agree with you. Dr. Raquib, thank you so much again for joining me today. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Tech on Earth is a production of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. For more, visit techethicslab.nd.edu.